All right, to our breaking news now on Pope Francis, head of the Catholic Church and sovereign of the Vatican City-State, has died aged 88.
Alle ore 7:35 di questa mattina, il Vescovo di Roma, Francesco, è tornato alla casa del Padre.
The morning of Easter Monday began quietly in Vatican City. It was the kind of silence that didn't last long. Within hours, it became clear something significant had happened. Just after 7:30 a.m., the Vatican issued a short, solemn statement confirming the death of Pope Francis. He passed away peacefully at the age of 88. Only the day before, millions around the world had seen him. Though visibly fragile, Pope Francis was present at Easter Sunday Mass, seated in his wheelchair, waving to the faithful gathered in St. Peter's Square. It was a powerful moment not just for Catholics, but for many who had followed his journey over the years. His physical condition had noticeably worsened, but his presence, his gentle smile, and his quiet wave still carried weight. No one expected it to be the last public appearance of his life. His death sent ripples through the Vatican almost immediately. That morning, Cardinal Leonardo Frell delivered the formal announcement to assembled clergy and staff. The statement was brief but carried emotional gravity. He said the Holy Father had returned to the eternal home he had spoken of so often throughout his life. Vatican flags were lowered to half-mast. Bells began to toll across Rome. Within minutes, the news had reached Catholic communities around the world. The reaction was swift and emotional. Some gathered at the gates of Vatican City, many in tears, praying quietly. Others stood still, stunned, trying to understand how someone they'd just seen alive the day before was suddenly gone. Eyewitnesses described a surreal calm in the early hours which quickly shifted to waves of grief. BBC reporter David Jaglani, reporting live from Rome, recalled how the square slowly filled with people, many of them still holding Easter candles from the previous night's vigil. In the city of Rome, there was a different kind of stillness. Shops and cafes opened late. Priests could be seen walking silently through the cobbled streets toward the Vatican, their faces marked with quiet sorrow. Inside local churches, impromptu masses were organized. Some were filled to capacity. Others remained half-empty, but no less reverent. This wasn't just a moment of religious importance, it was a human one. Pope Francis had become more than the leader of the Catholic Church. Over the years, he had emerged as a global moral figure. He was widely respected for his efforts to bring attention to issues often overlooked: poverty, displacement, inequality, and climate change. For many, his death felt personal. The shock of his passing was intensified by the contrast with his public appearance the day before. On Easter Sunday, though he did not speak directly, his voice had weakened significantly in recent months, he appeared at peace. His message, read out by an aide, touched on themes close to his heart. He spoke of peace, especially in conflict zones like Gaza and Ukraine. He urged world leaders to turn away from what he called the senseless craving for destruction. It was not a political speech, it was a pastoral one, more like a final prayer. For many, it now feels like a farewell message in disguise. Over the last year, Pope Francis's health had been a growing concern. He had been hospitalized in early 2025 due to severe pneumonia, a condition that was made worse by the fact that a portion of one of his lungs had been removed during his youth in Argentina. Despite the medical challenges, he continued his papal duties as much as possible. He insisted on maintaining his public engagements, even if they had to be shorter and less physically demanding. He often joked about his wheelchair, calling it his mobile pulpit. Behind the humor, though, it was clear he was facing increasing physical limitations. Even so, few expected the end to come so soon. Vatican insiders later shared that the Pope had experienced a rapid decline in the early hours of Easter Monday. Medical staff were present, but there was little they could do. Those with him described the final moments as peaceful. No alarm, no pain, just a quiet passing in the residence where he had chosen to live, instead of the traditional papal apartments. News outlets around the world began rolling coverage within minutes. From Rome to Rio, Manila to Montreal, headlines reflected the same sense of disbelief. Pope Francis dies at 88, many of them read, followed by a summary of his life and his final moments. World leaders, religious figures, and everyday people began sharing tributes. In Buenos Aires, where Jorge Mario Bergoglio was born, locals gathered outside his former parish. Some laid flowers, others lit candles. In a small church where he once preached, the pews quickly filled as people came to pray. For many Argentinians, this was not just the death of a pope, it was the farewell of one of their own. Back in St. Peter's Square, the atmosphere grew heavier as the day went on. The Vatican deployed additional security and crowd control teams, not to enforce order, but to help manage the growing number of people arriving to pay their respects. Some held signs with messages of gratitude, others simply knelt on the cold stone pavement in silent prayer. The media coverage focused not just on the fact of his death, but on the timing. Easter Monday is a significant day in the Christian calendar. It symbolizes renewal, resurrection, and the hope that follows suffering. That Pope Francis died on such a day added a symbolic weight to the moment. For some, it felt fitting. For others, it deepened the sense of loss. Church bells rang in cities across the world, from London to Lagos. Catholic schools held assemblies. In some places, national leaders declared days of mourning. Though the Vatican has a well-established protocol for the death of a pope, the sheer emotional impact of Francis's passing prompted responses that went beyond tradition. This was not the first time the world had said goodbye to a pope, but this farewell felt different. Francis had made a point of being accessible. He had chosen simplicity over splendor, dialogue over decree. He was the first pope to come from the Americas and the first Jesuit to lead the church. His death, then, was more than the end of a papacy. It was the end of an era that many had come to associate with a more compassionate and grounded vision of the Catholic Church. In the hours that followed the announcement, the Vatican began preparations for the official mourning period. The Camerlengo, the official tasked with verifying a pope's death, was seen entering the residence. His role would be crucial in initiating the series of rituals and responsibilities that follow the passing of a pontiff. These include sealing the pope's private apartments, notifying the College of Cardinals, and beginning preparations for the funeral and the upcoming conclave. But on that first day, the emphasis was not on protocol. It was in remembrance. The image of Pope Francis smiling gently from his wheelchair the day before lingered in many people's minds. It was the last glimpse of a man who had led one of the world's oldest institutions with humility, grace, and unwavering compassion. As the sun began to set over Rome, candles were lit across the city. In homes and chapels, prayers were whispered in multiple languages. And though the square outside St. Peter's Basilica grew quiet again, the feeling that something profound had ended remained. Long before the world knew him as Pope Francis, he was Jorge Mario Bergoglio. Born in Buenos Aires, Argentina on December 17, 1936, he grew up in a modest neighborhood, the son of Italian immigrants. His father, Mario, worked as a railway accountant, and his mother, Regina, cared for their 5 children. The Bergoglio family was religious but not overly devout. Their Catholic faith was present in their lives but didn't dominate it. Young Jorge's path to the priesthood wasn't straightforward. He was not a child destined for the clergy in the traditional sense. He was, by most accounts, a fairly ordinary teenager. He liked music, literature, and football. He enjoyed going out with friends and later admitted that he even had a girlfriend at one point. He worked various jobs, including as a janitor and a chemical technician in a food lab. One of his more unusual early jobs was working as a bouncer at a local nightclub, a detail that often surprises people, but which helped shape his understanding of human nature and street life. His spiritual awakening didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process, triggered by what he later described as a powerful experience of mercy during confession when he was 17 years old. It was a moment that stayed with him for the rest of his life. Soon after, he felt called to the priesthood. In 1958, he entered the Society of Jesus, more commonly known as the Jesuits, a religious order known for its emphasis on education, social justice, and missionary work. The Jesuit path is a demanding one. It requires years of study, spiritual formation, and service. For Bergoglio, this period shaped much of his worldview. He studied philosophy and theology, taught literature and psychology, and immersed himself in the Jesuit principles of discernment, humility, and service. He was ordained a priest in 1969 and took his final vows as a Jesuit in 1973. Not long after that, he became the provincial superior of the Jesuits in Argentina, a position of significant responsibility, especially given the political climate of the time. Argentina in the 1970s was a country in turmoil. The military dictatorship was known for human rights abuses, and the so-called Dirty War led to the disappearance and death of thousands. During this period, Bergoglio's leadership drew both praise and criticism. He worked quietly to protect those at risk, sheltering people and helping some flee the country. However, he also faced scrutiny over whether he did enough to oppose the regime publicly. These events would follow him for years and would later resurface when he became pope. While some accused him of not doing more, others, including those he helped save, spoke in his defense. Throughout his time in Argentina, Bergoglio developed a reputation as a humble and serious-minded priest. He avoided the spotlight and was known for his simplicity. He often chose to travel by bus and cooked his own meals. In 1992, he was appointed Auxiliary Bishop of Buenos Aires. 5 years later, he became the Archbishop. He focused his efforts on the poor and marginalized, often visiting slums and speaking out against social inequality. His leadership style was marked by directness and compassion. He was not known for long theological debates, but for practical action and pastoral care. In 2001, Pope John Paul II made him a cardinal. Even then, he remained somewhat of a mystery to the wider church. He was not a frequent traveler and rarely gave interviews. When he did speak, it was often with sharp clarity on social issues. He challenged corruption, defended workers' rights, and called out what he saw as indifference to poverty. In a world where church leaders were sometimes criticized for being disconnected from real-life struggles, Bergoglio stood out. His name first entered global conversations in 2005 during the conclave that followed the death of Pope John Paul II. He was considered a strong contender, although Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger was ultimately elected and became Pope Benedict XVI. At the time, many viewed Bergoglio as someone who could bring a more pastoral, grounded perspective to the papacy. But it wasn't his time, at least not yet. 8 years later, that changed. In February 2013, Pope Benedict XVI shocked the world by announcing his resignation, the first pope to do so in nearly 600 years. It set in motion a new conclave, one filled with speculation and uncertainty. The Church was facing internal challenges, ranging from scandals to questions about its relevance in a rapidly changing world. On March 13, 2013, white smoke billowed from the chimney of the Sistine Chapel. The name announced was Jorge Mario Bergoglio. He had been elected pope on the 5th ballot. As he stepped out onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, there was a collective pause. Many outside of Latin America didn't recognize his name. But what happened next left a lasting impression. He didn't begin with a grand speech. He didn't wave triumphantly or stand stiffly. Instead, he smiled and greeted the crowd with a simple, "Buonasera," good evening. He asked the crowd to pray for him before he offered his first papal blessing. From the beginning, his tone was personal and grounded. He chose the name Francis, after St. Francis of Assisi, the humble friar known for his love of the poor and his devotion to peace. It was the first time any pope had chosen that name. It sent a clear message. He also broke with several traditions from day one. He declined to wear the red velvet mozzetta, the formal shoulder cape typically worn by popes, and instead appeared in a plain white cassock. He chose to live in the Vatican guest house rather than the more opulent apostolic palace. He rode in a modest car and declined a bulletproof pope-mobile unless absolutely necessary. These choices weren't just symbolic. They reflected his long-standing commitment to humility, simplicity, and accessibility. The election of Pope Francis marked several historic firsts. He was the first pope from Latin America, the first from the Jesuit order, and the first non-European pope in more than 1,200 years. For many, his election signaled a shift in the Church, towards the global South, towards new voices, and towards a more inclusive vision of faith. From his earliest days as pope, he showed a different style of leadership. He washed the feet of prisoners, embraced people with visible disabilities, and made unannounced visits to shelters and soup kitchens. He often emphasized the importance of being close to the people, especially those who felt forgotten or left out by society and the church alike. His background as a working-class Argentinian gave him a different perspective from many of his predecessors. He understood poverty not as an abstract concept, but as a lived reality. His experiences shaped the way he spoke, the priorities he set, and the causes he championed. In interviews, he often downplayed his own role. He reminded people that the church's mission was not about hierarchy, but about service. He once said that he imagined a church that was bruised and dirty because it had been out in the streets rather than being shut up and clinging to its own security. In many ways, Pope Francis brought the Catholic Church closer to the everyday person. He didn't change doctrine, but he shifted the tone. He encouraged dialogue, pushed for mercy, and tried to make the church a place that welcomed rather than judged. His leadership style made him popular well beyond traditional religious circles. He was featured on magazine covers, praised by environmentalists, and quoted by world leaders. But for all the attention, he remained a figure who often tried to turn the focus away from himself and back to the people he served. From his very first actions as Pope, Francis made it clear that he intended to do things differently. The choice of his name, Francis, was a quiet but powerful signal. Inspired by St. Francis of Assisi, the name pointed to values of poverty, humility, peace, and care for creation. It was not a name chosen lightly. In fact, he later explained that when he was elected, one of the cardinals whispered to him, "Don't forget the poor." That comment stayed with him, and it guided many of his decisions in the years that followed. Francis quickly became known as a pope who broke with convention. Instead of living in the grand apostolic palace, he chose a modest suite in the Casa Santa Marta, a guest house within the Vatican. He said he preferred to be around people, not alone in a palace. He also gave up other traditional symbols of papal authority, including the red shoes and certain ceremonial garments. He kept his clothing simple and his tone direct. He spoke frequently about the need for a church that is poor and for the poor. He visited slums and refugee camps, prisons and shelters, often embracing individuals who were normally overlooked. He was photographed washing the feet of prisoners, including Muslims and women, during Holy Week, a break from centuries of tradition. These were not just symbolic acts. They reflected his deeper belief that the church should be out in the world serving people where they were. His public speeches and writings often focused less on doctrine and more on human dignity. He addressed poverty, environmental degradation, and social injustice with urgency. In his 2015 encyclical Laudato Si, he called for greater care for the environment, describing the planet as our common home. The document was widely praised beyond religious circles and sparked conversations across governments, schools, and environmental organizations. It was a rare moment when a religious text became a global talking point. Francis also made efforts to reform the Vatican bureaucracy, known as the Roman Curia. While progress was gradual, he took steps to improve transparency, especially in financial matters. He pushed for accountability in the management of church resources and supported investigations into corruption and misconduct. These actions earned him both praise and resistance within the church. Some viewed his changes as necessary and long overdue. Others felt that he was moving too quickly or stepping outside the bounds of tradition. Perhaps one of the most noticeable changes was his tone. Francis encouraged priests and bishops to be closer to their communities. He often warned against what he called clericalism, the idea that church leaders should be distant or superior to the people they serve. He reminded them that leadership in the church should be based on humility, not hierarchy. He also opened the door to difficult conversations. While he upheld traditional teachings on issues like marriage and sexuality, he spoke about them in a different way. He famously said, "Who am I to judge?" when asked about gay Catholics seeking a relationship with God. This simple sentence sparked headlines around the world. Though it did not signal a change in church policy, it showed a shift in approach. He prioritized listening over lecturing, accompaniment over condemnation. Throughout his papacy, Francis met with people from all walks of life: refugees, migrants, disabled individuals, non-Catholic religious leaders, and even those critical of the church. He promoted interfaith dialogue and made historic visits to predominantly Muslim countries, including the United Arab Emirates and Iraq. In each place, he called for mutual respect and peaceful coexistence. He also built bridges with the Jewish and Orthodox communities, showing that dialogue was possible even in the most complex religious landscapes. Francis consistently emphasized mercy. In 2016, he declared a Holy Year of Mercy, encouraging Catholics around the world to focus on compassion and forgiveness. He wanted the Church to be known less for rules and more for reconciliation. In his vision, the Church was not a fortress to defend, but a field hospital after battle, a place where people could come for healing, not judgment. As his health began to decline, Francis continued to lead with determination. He scaled back his travel but remained actively engaged in global conversations. In his later speeches and writings, he became even more vocal about inequality, war, and the climate crisis. He warned about what he saw as a growing culture of indifference and called on the world to choose solidarity over selfishness. In his final months, Pope Francis still appeared in public, though with increasing physical difficulty. He often needed assistance and used a wheelchair, but his presence remained strong. During his last Easter Sunday appearance, his voice was too weak to deliver the message himself. Instead, it was read by an aide. But the words were unmistakably his. He spoke of peace and the need to reject hatred and violence. He referenced ongoing conflicts and asked leaders to act with courage. It was a final message that summed up the heart of his papacy. Behind the public figure was a man who never lost touch with his roots. He often spoke about his youth in Buenos Aires, about the lessons he learned from ordinary people. He referred to himself not as a king, but as a servant. He reminded Catholics that the Church's mission was not to seek privilege, but to offer hope, especially to those at the edges of society. His papacy wasn't without criticism. Some conservatives felt he pushed the Church too far toward modernity, while some progressives wished he had gone further on issues like women's ordination or LGBTQ+ inclusion. But even his critics often acknowledged his sincerity and moral clarity. He didn't aim to please one side or the other. He aimed to shepherd a global church through times of rapid change. Over the course of 11 years, Pope Francis became one of the most recognizable religious leaders in the world. He was a man who chose to speak with ordinary language, who used gestures more than proclamations, and who continually pointed away from himself and toward others. He reminded people that faith is not just about belief, but about action. Not just about institutions, but about individuals. He redefined what it meant to be Pope in the 21st century, not through doctrine, but through example. His legacy is not carved in marble or sealed in documents. It lives in the actions of those he inspired. In the hands of volunteers serving meals, in the voices of refugees he embraced, in the churches that opened their doors a little wider because of his words. According to established Vatican protocol, the first official step after the death of a pope involves the Camerlengo, the cardinal responsible for managing the Church's affairs between pontificates. In keeping with centuries-old custom, the Camerlengo enters the papal residence where he verifies the death by calling the pope's baptismal name, Jorge Mario, 3 times. When there is no reply, the death is officially declared. The papal ring, known as the fisherman's ring, is then removed and later destroyed. This symbolic act marks the end of the pope's ability to govern and prevents the seal from being misused. Historically, the funeral of a pope is a complex affair, rich in symbolism and marked by layers of tradition. The days following the confirmation of death are referred to as the Novem Diales, a 9-day period of mourning that includes prayers, liturgies, and public rites. During this time, the late pope's body is usually displayed in St. Peter's Basilica, placed on a raised platform known as a catafalque. Thousands of faithful pilgrims typically pass by, many praying quietly or leaving tokens of gratitude. Pope Francis, however, has made it clear that he does not wish to follow this path in full. Long before his passing, he expresses his desire for a simpler farewell. In official documents and through conversations with close aides, he outlines several key changes to the traditional funeral rites, changes that reflect his values of modesty and service. One of the most significant decisions involves the matter of the coffin. Traditionally, 3 coffins are used for papal burials. The innermost, made of cypress wood, symbolizes humility. It is placed inside a lead coffin that represents permanence and strength. The outer coffin, made of oak, reflects the dignity of the Church. The 3 layers together serve a dual purpose. preserving the body and signifying the solemn weight of the papal office. Francis, known for his plain lifestyle, opts for something different. He asks to be buried in a single wooden coffin lined with zinc for preservation. The design is plain, unadorned except for a simple cross and a modest engraving of his papal seal. This choice echoes his decision early in his papacy to live in the Casa Santa Marta guest house rather than the Apostolic Palace, and to wear simple vestments rather than ornate ceremonial garments. Another departure from tradition is the manner in which his body is to be presented to the public. Historically, popes lie in state, with the body visible in full papal dress. Francis requests something more understated. He prefers that his body remain in the coffin with the lid partially open for those who wish to offer prayers. He declines the use of a grand platform, asking instead for a more intimate and prayerful setting. The location of his burial is also a reflection of his distinct approach. For over a century, popes have been buried in the crypt beneath St. Peter's Basilica, known as the Vatican grottos. These underground chambers contain the tombs of many former pontiffs, including St. John Paul II and Benedict XVI. The crypt is sacred, but relatively hidden from the everyday movement of the city. Francis chooses a different destination. He requests to be buried in the Basilica of St. Mary Major, one of the 4 major basilicas in Rome. This church holds deep personal meaning for him. Throughout his papacy, he makes a point of visiting the basilica before and after major trips, often stopping there to pray quietly before the icon of the Virgin Mary known as Salus Populi Romani. His devotion to this image is well known, and the basilica becomes one of his spiritual refuges. By choosing this location, Francis ensures that his final resting place remains accessible to the public. Unlike the crypt beneath St. Peter's, St. Mary Major is situated in the heart of the city. Tourists, pilgrims, locals, and the curious can easily enter and pay their respects. This openness reflects his long-standing commitment to being a pope among the people. Even in death, he hopes to remain close to those he serves. While the Vatican still prepares to honor the death of a pope with solemn dignity, many of the traditional markers are being reshaped. Though cardinals, bishops, and heads of state are expected to attend, Francis makes it clear that ordinary people should not be pushed to the margins. Invitations extend to people from all walks of life: refugees, the homeless, inmates, charity workers, and parish volunteers. Those who have shared in his ministry are not only welcome but central to the proceedings. The funeral liturgy itself, while guided by protocol, is also expected to reflect Francis's pastoral tone. The readings and prayers focus not just on the role of the Pope, but on his lifelong call to mercy, solidarity, and care for the environment. His encyclicals, homilies, and unscripted remarks are often woven into the prayers, connecting his words with the Church's farewell. In surrounding parts of Rome, shopkeepers notice a sharp increase in the sale of white lilies and red roses, flowers commonly associated with papal funerals and Marian devotion. Candle vendors, too, see long lines forming outside their shops. The streets near the Vatican begin to fill with quiet vigils and spontaneous acts of remembrance. For many observers, both within and outside the Catholic community, the way Francis prepares for his death is entirely in character. He often speaks of death not with fear, but with peace. In interviews, he talks about it as a passage, a return to God. On more than one occasion, he jokes about preparing his affairs early so that others are not burdened. His humor never fully hides the depth of his reflection on mortality, which remains a theme throughout his papacy. During his years as Pope, Francis often reminds the Church that what matters most is not the show of religion, but its substance. He warns against clerical privilege, institutional arrogance, and rituals that lose their connection to human experience. In his view, the Church must always return to the core message of the gospel: love, service, and humility. His choices around death are simply a continuation of that message. The period following a pope's death is, by nature, both a farewell and a beginning. It is a moment when the world reflects on the past and begins to imagine what comes next. In the case of Francis, the sense of transition is felt more deeply because of the very nature of his papacy. He leads not through spectacle, but through example. His decision to simplify the funeral rites serves as one final act of leadership. As the Vatican moves through these rituals, the meaning behind each one becomes clearer. the plain coffin, the public basilica, the reduced pomp. They are not rejections of tradition, but clarifications of it. For Francis, the essence of these moments lies not in their grandeur, but in their grace, in the quiet prayers whispered by visitors, in the candles lit by strangers, in the space left behind for others to step into. Through these choices, Pope Francis continues to offer a message to the Church and the world, that in the end, greatness is not about how many follow you, but how many you choose to walk with. That holiness does not need a spotlight, and that even the most powerful figure in the Church can choose a path that leads, quite simply, back to the people. In the days after the death of Pope Francis, Rome enters a period of quiet reflection. The bells of St. Peter's no longer ring in mourning, but the sense of loss still lingers in the streets, churches, and chapels across the city. Candles continue to flicker outside cathedrals, and handwritten notes rest beneath statues and doorways. Pilgrims, locals, and curious travelers walk through the piazzas, their pace a little slower, their eyes lifted occasionally toward the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, as if searching for meaning in its silence. Inside the Vatican, preparations move steadily toward the next chapter in the life of the Catholic Church. The mood is not one of ceremony alone, but of discernment. The Church, after all, is not simply losing a leader. It is engaging in one of its oldest and most sacred transitions. As prescribed by long-standing tradition, the College of Cardinals gathers in Rome. They represent every continent, bringing with them not only theological knowledge and spiritual insight, but also the hopes and concerns of their regions. These cardinals, numbering just over 100 eligible voters under the age of 80, meet daily for a series of discussions known as general congregations. These gatherings are not debates. They are spaces for prayer, listening, and shared reflection. Each cardinal has the opportunity to speak, to raise issues, to highlight qualities they believe the next pope should embody. The tone is respectful. There is no campaigning, no lobbying. The conclave is not a political convention, it is a spiritual moment. The Sistine Chapel, where the conclave eventually takes place, remains closed to the public. Its painted ceiling by Michelangelo, depicting the story of creation and the final judgment, watches silently over the space. In this room, the cardinals cast their votes in complete secrecy. Devices are disabled. Communication with the outside world is suspended. The cardinals eat and sleep in the Vatican guest house, but all of their movements during the voting period are tightly regulated. The focus is meant to remain on prayer and discernment. While the world looks toward the chimney that will eventually release white or black smoke, the cardinals are considering a deeply complex question. What kind of leadership does the Church need now? The question is not just about doctrine or governance, it is about presence, tone, and spiritual vision. Francis left behind a papacy defined by humility, global inclusion, and an emphasis on mercy. He shifted attention to the margins of society, encouraged dialogue across religious boundaries, and repeatedly challenged the Church to look outward rather than inward. Many believe his influence continues to shape the conversations among the cardinals. His focus on the environment, on interfaith understanding, on welcoming the poor and refugees, these themes remain fresh in the minds of those tasked with choosing his successor. Some cardinals speak of the need for continuity, not necessarily in every detail, but in the broad spirit of Francis's work. Others express concerns about balance, about the need to preserve certain traditions and teachings, while also engaging with the challenges of a fast-changing world. Beyond the Vatican, believers and observers alike reflect on the global Church as it stands today. In Africa, the Catholic population continues to grow, with vibrant communities and new vocations. In Asia, the Church faces challenges of persecution and coexistence within pluralistic societies. In Latin America, long considered a stronghold of the Catholic faith, Protestantism has gained ground in recent years. Europe, while still symbolically central to Catholicism, wrestles with secularism and a declining number of practicing believers. The Church is present in all of these regions, and so is the weight of representation. As Rome becomes the focal point of global Catholic attention, communities across the world gather in their own ways. In the Philippines, masses are said in packed churches, with worshipers lighting candles for guidance and unity. In Mexico, vigils are held not only in major cathedrals but in small neighborhood chapels. In Nigeria, choirs sing hymns that speak of hope and resilience. In Germany and France, young Catholics hold quiet prayer sessions, sharing reflections on what kind of church they want to belong to. This period between papacies often prompts deep questions, not just about leadership, but about purpose. Francis often spoke about a church that walks with people, especially those on the margins. He described the church as a field hospital, a place for healing and accompaniment, not judgment. That image resonates now more than ever. Many Catholics find themselves asking whether the church can maintain this pastoral spirit while remaining grounded in its spiritual and theological roots. Media coverage, though extensive, often struggles to capture the personal nature of this moment. For many, it is not about geopolitics or doctrinal analysis. It is about feeling seen, included, and spiritually nourished. People remember Pope Francis not only for his speeches, but for his gestures, for hugging the disabled, washing the feet of prisoners, and visiting refugee camps. These moments are not easily forgotten, and they create a backdrop for everything unfolding now. At the same time, the conclave process is not without tension. It is a moment of unity, but also of difference. Cardinals bring varying perspectives, shaped by culture, experience, and local realities. Some come from dioceses dealing with war and poverty. Others lead in nations where the church is increasingly under public scrutiny. The next pope will have to understand and carry all of this, not as a politician, but as a shepherd. There is also a quiet recognition that whoever is chosen will follow a figure who redefined the role in many ways. Pope Francis changed how people saw the papacy. He resisted grandeur, focused on service, and never tried to appear above others. He was deeply respected, even beyond Catholic circles, and often served as a moral compass on global issues. To follow that legacy will not be easy, not because of its perfection, but because of its humanity. The Church as an institution carries centuries of tradition and responsibility. But moments like this remind people that it is also made up of human beings, of parish priests, community leaders, religious sisters, parents, children, students, and elders. The questions being asked in the Sistine Chapel echo in homes, schools, and workplaces around the world. What kind of church will this be moving forward? Will it continue to build bridges rather than walls? Will it speak clearly on justice, peace, and dignity? Will it hold space for those who feel distant from religion but still long for meaning? These questions are not only for the cardinals to answer. They are shared by millions who see the church not just as a structure, but as a spiritual family. The memory of Pope Francis, his words, his choices, his way of being, remains present in these conversations. It reminds people of what is possible when leadership is grounded in love, courage, and humility. As the Vatican continues its solemn preparations, there is no rush. The rhythm of this time remains slow and intentional. Liturgies are held each day. Prayer fills the air. And the cardinals, under the watchful gaze of Michelangelo's paintings, reflect on their task. The world waits, not just for smoke to rise, but for a sign of direction. And in the stillness, many begin to understand that the next step is not only about a name, but about a mission. One that began long ago and continues through the choices made now, not in secrecy, but in trust.